Hello everybody, welcome back. I am bringing you January's meta report for Warhammer 40k Warpforge. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the current meta. This is largely my opinion, guys. I'm not data mining. All I'm doing is speaking to top players. I've played a lot of games myself, so I'm kind of producing this video to really give you an idea as to kind of like what you can expect, what's working, what's powerful, and that's the way that we sort of go about this. Now I'm changing the format slightly, so those of you who saw the December and the November report, I'm basically going with a very simple tiers 1 to 4. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to like pull out some of the key decks that I'm seeing being played that fall into this kind of tier 1 to 4 category. Now there is like tier 5, which is sort of like meme tier if you like. Doesn't mean those decks can't pick up wins, they can, but they do tend to be memes. And it also doesn't mean there aren't other decks that might be in the tiers 1 to 4. You may have, for example, tweaked a deck, come up with your own version, and that could well be power level wise on par with some of the ones we're going to talk about today. But what I'm really focusing on are the ones that I've seen or from speaking to players that are definitely being played in the top 50, and you can expect to come up against yourself. So that's the format. Last thing to say as well before we jump into the decks is that it's often very much the case that, for example, a tier 2 deck is favourable in a matchup against a tier 1 deck. So it doesn't just mean that the lower the tier, the worse the deck is, but it does mean that if you're talking about like grinding ladder, for example, it does generally mean that the higher tier decks are better for that because they tend to be more consistent across the matchup spread. Okay, so with that said, let's dive in. So first of all, looking at top tier, tier 1, what are the top tier decks in the meta right now? And surprise, surprise, even though Ghazghkull got nerfed, and even though the Orcs did get hit with two pretty decent nerfs that very much were needed, one being Ghazghkull's Warlord ability, and then the other one being the kind of called the Makari cheese combo, where you could keep bringing him on and on and on after a green horde. Both of those things are no longer in the game. That said, Orcs are still very, very powerful, and as such, we've got 2 Orc decks that I'm bringing you that are in the tier 1 category. So first up, we've got Ghazghkull Agro. Now, when we talk about Ghazghkull Agro, there are going to be different versions of the deck, but I'm just going to show you the one that I ran an 80% win rate with over 10 games. It's ridiculous. So, I'm not going to go through card for card, but this is kind of what the tier 1 deck looks like. It's very low to the ground. It's heavily focused on chipping away at the enemy's health right from the start of the game. We do run things like the Grot in this version, now that Ghazghkull doesn't automatically give you 2 Grots. By running the one drop Grot, which obviously means that for 3 energy you can play 3 of these, you can combine that quite nicely with Unbridled Carnage to just put a lot of cheap damage onto your opponent. And honestly guys, this deck, when I was playing it, it just felt broken still to me. Again, there are different versions. I know Space Marine's been running this in the top 10 or something similar, and you're getting damage from everything, right? The Scorcher Assault's hitting face, the banner knobs buffing damage to face, the Makari does the same. You've got the Squigs, in the 2 drops, and you've got the Squig Buggy, and they're again going to do damage, 2 to 3 damage to enemy face. So everything is doing damage to face. It's really potent. If people play Vanguard, you've obviously got the Paramaniacs that can get around it, and you've got the big finishers in the deck are obviously still the Warbiker and the Proper Killy, and when you combine those with, like I said, a Makari or a banner knob, giving the +1 bonus, you can do quite a lot of reach, basically somewhere between 10 and 18 reach from hand. So this deck is really potent, and I would suggest, like, if you're looking for the aggro deck, this to me is right up there. So in tier 1 we have got the Ghazghkull Agro. Now also in tier 1, and similarly from the Orcs, is the old Grot Control. I used to call it Rock Hard Control. If you go back and look through my guides, you can see they're very, very relevant now. And let's just show you what that kind of looks like. So so the Grot Control, and again there are slightly different variants of this. So one of my best friends, Alski, only started playing the game about a month ago. He actually reached rank 1 on ladder. He's gone on holiday for a week. I think he's dropped down to like 5th at the minute, but he was rank 1 with a version very similar to this. I think he might have run 1 Unbridled Carnage instead of Pyromaniacs, but other than that I believe that his list is identical to this. So what are we doing with this list? Still one of my favourite lists, one of my favourite decks in the game. Just super flexible. It's not the easiest. I wouldn't say it's as easy as other decks. You'll definitely lose some games because you misplay, but it's one of the reasons I love it. You know, making good use of Grook's fantastic Warlord ability. Still probably my favourite ability, Warlord ability in the game, and always having a Swiss Army knife of options available to you that you can play. There's lots of different choices to make, lots of different paths that you can take, lots of different lines of play, and the deck's just full of great control tools, whether it's the Orc Knob and all of the flankers, you know, the veteran Storm Boys synergize with the Storm Boys, so you can attack with the Storm Boys and essentially give them flank. You can do all sorts of combos with the Green Horde, whether it's obviously making your Sluggers and Storm Boys dirt cheap and whacking an Arder's Nails on them to make sure they survive the AoE, or whether it's a sort of turn 7 where you play the veteran Storm Boy followed by the Storm Boys as we talked about earlier. There's lots of different things in there. We run the Ard Shell to give us a nice Vanguard unit. We run the hard removal obviously in the double Will of Gork and in the double No Mucking About. And we also run, importantly in this deck, the double Iron Gob, and people might have forgotten about this card last season, but it's super important because Grook is vulnerable, and it gives you really good heal, and not only that, but Concussive's pretty good right now. Again, if you're coming up against Ghazghkull aggro, you know, you hit Ghazghkull when you're down to around 15 health with this, and then all of a sudden he can't hit you with his proper killy combination and things like that. So 2 of those is really important. Don't forget the Arder's Nails also, the +2 health does go on the Warlord as well. So just again full of really good Orc cards, this deck, really good removal, and of course we've got the big old trusty Rock Invasion if we need it at the end as well. So yeah, so that's the Grot Control. It's powerful as ever, and right up there, tier 1 I would say in the current meta. Okay, so next up we have got we've got the Swarm Lord, and yeah, I wasn't sure about this one, but I do think the Swarm Lord has finally got his day in the sun. Why is Swarm Lord so good? Well, he's just got strong matchups. The Swarm Lord tends to do well against Imhotep, it tends to do well against Abaddon, it tends to do pretty well against Marines. The main weakness is actually Orcs, and that's, you know, we've just shown you 2 Orc decks that are up there right now in the meta that will give Swarm Lord problems. So if you are coming up against a lot of Swarm Lord, definitely consider one of those. And really, if it wasn't for Orcs, I think Swarm Lord would be literally running rampant right now. But other than that, he tends to have really good matchups across the board. We do run in this deck the Augmented Ferocity, yeah, which is the heal 3 +2 melee attack. You can run the enhanced organism which is only 2 energy and heals for 3. It doesn't give the melee attack, so it's up to you like what your flavour of heal is in there. But the big addition really to the Swarm Lord version that we saw in the last season is the Gene Stealer. Obviously the buff to this now becoming stealth unit instead of camouflage is really great, because let's be honest, Swarm Lord always struggled a little bit in the early game, and turn 3 was a bit of a weak spot. Well, not turn 3, energy 3, which is turn 2. And so now the Gene Stealer fills that really nicely. I still think the Gene Stealer probably fits a little bit better with Neurothrop, because you can use it with his Warlord talent a bit easier than you can in here, but still filling that kind of blind spot, if you like, that 3E turn, I think is really important. And it's the usual stuff, just full of very powerful bodies. You've got the Tunic Guard to help things survive, and then you've got the big combination with the Ravenous Hunter. So yeah, there's different variants of this version. You don't have to run the Screamer Killers if you want a slightly lower curve. You could stick Tyranid Warriors in there, for example, but overall something like this is the Swarm Lord. And again, if you want to see full deck guides on this, I've got 2 videos now that go into much more depth on this, so I'll let you go and find those on my channel. Okay, so next up we have got Tier 2. Now the first one for Tier 2 is Galin Tempo. I wasn't sure whether this was Tier 2 or Tier 3, but I think it is actually still Tier 2. Galin's been it's been pretty much a staple kind of hovering around this power level for some time now. It's quite a fair deck, I would say, a strong but fair deck. This particular version's a little bit spicy. I got this from Cube Catten. It's not the normal version. The normal version doesn't run the Wraith Knights. It usually would run the Wailing Doom instead, and it would probably not run the Reclaim the Stars as well. So generally speaking, it would probably, if you don't want those cards, if you want something a little bit more traditional, you'd run things like the Webway Gate to help you with a bit of card draw, and you'd probably also run the 5 drops in there as well, which I don't think is in this version, which is the Spirit Seers. But I just thought, you know, people have seen that deck for quite a few months now. Nothing much has changed. The Eldar didn't receive any buffs, and I think Cube Catten's come up with quite an interesting little bit of a spin on the deck. It's doing the same thing. It's just that because it pumps out so much, I think he calls it low cost spam, because it pumps out so many Spirit Stone bodies early game, you're actually able to get Reclaim the Stars off quite easily in this deck without needing the Infinity Gate, and that allows you to pull you know, potentially cheap Wraith Knights, right? If you're getting a Wraith Knight for 5 energy, I mean, wow. And not to also forget that the Wraith Knight, unlike a lot of other big units, does have the potential to come down and gain invulnerable until your next turn. Guys, that's pretty powerful. Like, even if somebody will have gawks the board, that means this thing will just stand there and go, yeah, whatever, as the dust settled, yeah, I'm still here and I'm ready to go. So it's a pretty good game winner. Obviously, if you don't get the invulnerable off and it does get hit by a no mucking about something, then it's super vulnerable. But it's like one of the few big units that has this chance to just kind of like not be touched and actually get to swing. So if you want to have some fun with Galin, I definitely recommend trying this out and giving it a spin. But if you want, as I say, if you want the more traditional route, then you don't need to run the Wraith Knights or the Reclaim the Stars. It's all about building really early tempo with the Guardians, getting the Warlock buff. That's the key to this deck, really. And then using your stones on those really good mid-range units and getting your legendaries in to kind of finish the game early. Okay, so other than Galin, we have got the Grook Agro. Now again, this is quite a it's been around a long time, this one. There are slightly different versions of it. Some people run the 3-drop Horde unit. I'm not a big fan of that deck, but basically what you're trying to do here is use Grook's ability to draw into an early Green Horde. You probably mulligan quite hard for Green Horde and Makari, and then similar to the Ghazghkull aggro, the main difference is that you've actually got a Green Horde or, like, you know, Slugger, Stormboy spam in this, which you don't have in the Ghazghkull aggro. So it's a slightly different way of doing it. I would say that it's a little bit less consistent than Ghazghkull. Plus, obviously, you've got Grook, who is a little bit more vulnerable, but the power spike in this, obviously, if you do get Green Horde off early, is probably even bigger than the Ghazghkull one. So, you know, it's just another way to do it, and it's a super powerful deck. Next up, we have got in the Aurican Scarabs. Now, the Scarab deck, I'll be honest, I haven't seen it much this season. It was very good last season because it had a good match against Ghazghkull. I don't know, because I've not played the all-out Scarabs too much, so I don't know if this is a good deck list or not. I'm not going to lie. I've not really tested it, but the basic idea of the build is relevant, which is we try to use Spider's Nest, or we try to use Scarabs to build a Scarab board and play a spell every time, so that we basically have a full board of Scarabs. We attack with 4 of them, so we've still got half a board. Then we play a spell, so we go back up to 8. Then we attack with the other 4, and they die. And then we play another spell, and we end the turn with 8 Scarabs. That's basically what you're trying to do. So you need lots and lots of spells, or stratagems, as they're called in Warpforge. And you know, the other thing is then we finish with the big self-destruct. This card is broken and probably needs a nerf. Dealing 3 damage. We can do 24 damage if we've got 8 Scarabs on the board, so that's really disgusting. In addition, we've got things like the Annihilation command legendary as well, so we can just make our Scarabs go really big and attack as well. So yeah, it's all about basically controlling the board with Scarabs and then playing one of those big finishers. Very good deck at the minute, and as I say, a very good counter into Ghazghkull. Then we've got the Neuro Sinaps in Tier 2, and I have to say this has been one of my favourite decks. So the Neurothrope is slightly less powered overall than the Swarmlord. However, I find it to be a little bit more consistent. I find it to be a bit more comfortable to pilot. Swarmlord's difficult because it struggles with flyers, and the curve's not as easy with a 2 energy Warlord talent, whereas this guy has a 1 energy Warlord talent. It's much easier to combine that and get good use with Sinaps. So we make use of that. We've got a slightly earlier curve, so it's a bit easier to manage from a mulligan point of view, and we've got quite a lot of spores that we can kick out, whether it's from the Biovore or whether it's from the Sporocysts. And let's not get it right twisted. You know, the spore mines often don't do anything because they get taken out, but what you've got to remember is every time your opponent does that, even if they take it out with a range attack so they don't take damage back, they still had to divert their attack to do that. So it does save you a lot on the health front as well. And to compensate for the slightly lower curve, we can play a couple of big units in the obviously the Broodlord, but the Hive Crones, and we include the Hive Tyrant. And the Hive Tyrant, you know, the Synaptic Imperative is very good because unlike the Swarmlord, we don't have a way to kind of grow our units as much, and the Synaptic Imperative just really helps us do that late in the game. So overall, Neurothrope is very powerful right now. It's been really quite consistent for me on ladder. It's one of my main ladder decks at the minute. Really enjoying this deck, and I've got a guide. If it's not out yet, it will be out very soon around this deck as well. Okay, so that is Tier 2, guys. So let's move on to Tier 3. And again, remember what I said, it doesn't mean that, you know, Tier 3 decks can't beat Tier 1 or Tier 2 decks. They often can. And the next one that I'm going to talk about, I think, is a very good one for ladder, very, very good for climbing. I've actually got 2 versions of it. I've got this one, which is, you can actually see my Urial Venturous aggro. I've got a full guide for this again on my channel if you want to go and check that out. I really like this deck. I think it's got it's an aggro deck. You can play games quick, but it's got skill level as well. You know, you've really got a mulligan correct. You've got to think about when to use your tactical insights, and basically what you're doing is playing a very low curve, taking control of the board early, typical aggro, just beating your opponent down, and they often find themselves like 15 to 20 health before turn 5, and then you can finish off. You know, you've got a few late game sort of finishes in things like Calcius. You know, Calcius with if you get a tactical insight with Calcius, that's 6 damage there, and then the 2 death from above, that's 14 damage just between those. So this deck is just all about the beatdown, and I think it's a great deck for laddering right now. This version's slightly different. It tries to make use of Antonio Kronos, who's actually really just a potent card for the stats at 4 energy, and obviously if that draws into an Impulsor, giving it 2 armor, that's really great, and even better, we include 1 Dreadnought as well. So just a very slight variant in there, but either of those versions, I think it's in a solid Tier 3. If I'm honest with you guys, this is actually the deck that I struggled with the most. I think there's a really good argument it's Tier 2. I had it in Tier 2 originally. I was talking with the Ecclesiarch about it. In the end, we kind of put it down in Tier 3, but I honestly think there's a good argument it could be bottom of Tier 2, to be honest. Okay, so next up we have got Imatech Control. Now, Imatech Control is a really standard deck now. It's so standard I've not even included it here. It's been in the game like pretty much unchanged now since early access. Yeah, it hasn't changed much. You play down your flankers, you play down your Lich Guard, and then you Tomb World and bring everything back. And the only thing I'll say about Imatech, and the main reason why he's Tier 3 and probably not as high as he's been previously, is just because he doesn't have great matchups into things like you know, the uber aggro matches like Gazgul, Uriel. He's not bad against Uriel, but it depends how aggro they go off, I suppose. And the other thing is he struggles a little bit with struggles a lot with Swarmlord actually, and he can struggle a bit with Grook as well. So just not fantastic matchups right now for Imatech. Although we have got Balduko's, I think, an Imatech only player. I could be wrong about that, but he has got something like 14 or 1500 wins with Imatech, and he's right up towards the top of the ladder. So again, it doesn't mean that if you don't know what you're doing with this deck, you can't climb with it. But for me, I've looked at the sort of matchups and I've put him down in tier 3. Again, I probably wouldn't argue too strongly if someone made the good case for him being tier 2, but I think this is the season where actually just a matchup wise he's probably a little bit weaker than he has been in the last 2 seasons. Okay, so next up we've got the kind of mid-range Marines. Now I've gone with the Ecclesiarch's Tigerius build, but you could swap this out for Manius Calgar, and I've just called this the kind of mid-range vehicle build. Now some people go all in on the vehicles, some people go like a lot lighter on the vehicles and just have a few, but then they have more sort of mid-range bodies. But the idea is it's a bit slower than the Uriel deck. As we can see here in the Tigerius build, it actually makes use of the synergy cards of the battlefield supremacy. Obviously being able to pull that from Tigerius's ability to just pull stratagems, that's a really good synergy, and probably what makes Tigerius the best leader if you want to go down the vehicle route. It's a good argument, but it's probably a little bit more consistent. We've got some really nice mid-range bodies and a really good curve in this deck. It goes all the way up to, you know what, for my money, some of the better late game units. I think the Redemptor Dreadnought, the Repulsor Executioners, actually, you know, this is actually a playable 10-drop, which is great to see in the game, and I hope we get more of this sort of thing. So this is a fun deck, and I think it's pretty good as well right now. Okay, so next up we have the tier 4 decks, and as I say, we have tier 5, which would be some of the meme decks in tier 5, but in tier 4 I'm starting out with Abaddon. Now there are a few different Abaddon builds. I understand that there are a few. I think Gilliman's running like more of a late game Chaos deck. I've run up against the Chaos deck this season that had gone down the kind of build a really big unit with lots of armor and all that sort of thing. There's lots of different ways you can kind of go about building it, but I've actually gone with something that actually based this off the Ecclesiarch's Harken aggro deck, and then I actually exchanged Harken for Abaddon. I still think Abaddon's better. I think Abaddon being able to heal himself, I think Abaddon having 40 health is really important when you're doing the race, and this deck's pretty good. You know, this deck, if you mulligan correctly, it can get on board. It reminds me a little bit of the Uriel deck in that you can just get on board early and you can just really start to put the beat down on, and then hopefully you draw into things like Draconim and Hellstrike late game for a kind of finisher. But again, just really quick games. Very much about early board control, and then using your spells and stuff to kind of, you know, execution to push through bigger units, Bringer of Decay to kind of put extra damage on, etc, etc. So you know, again, not being too explicit, there are different versions of the deck. This is just one I quite like, but I would say that it's overall highly played. You're going to come up against Abaddon a lot on ladder. It's quite a fan favourite and you've seen him a lot, but in terms of win rate, I think it's probably closer to tier 4. So last but not least, one of my very favourite decks in the game. I've put Anvia Control, and I made a full deck guide about this very recently, so I literally think it's called My Favourite Deck. If you want to go and check that out on my YouTube channel, I talk a lot about this deck. I actually ran 20 games on ladder this season with it against human opponents and did alright. I think it's a really difficult deck to pilot well, but there's a lot of satisfaction in it and a lot of fun, and it's all about kind of surviving in the early game and then getting to the point where you find this infinity circuit and reclaim the stars combo, which then gives you one of the essentially biggest tempo pushers in the game that there is. It's insane because you get a huge discount where you draw 5 cards into your hand and discount them all for 5. I run the Hemlock and the Wailing Doom, which again would only cost 3 if they come off the Reclaim the Stars. But generally speaking, we try to keep most of our things, around that kind of 5 mark or less, because then we can essentially play them for free off of Reclaim the Stars. So when this deck goes off and works, it's just fantastic and feels like it can beat anything. But it definitely is a consistency issue, and that's for me why it is in tier 4. Okay, so there you go, guys. If you didn't see your favourite deck on there, I apologise. It doesn't mean that there aren't other decks that could be in those tiers. These are just some common decks. You can definitely expect to see the variants of them, but these sort of concepts that I've covered today, and hopefully that's just helped you kind of figure out where the power levels currently are and what to expect. If you did like it, please drop me a like. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that what have you been playing this season? What are you coming up against? Are there any of the things you think I've got wrong in the wrong tiers? That's great. Let's have a conversation about it. And also, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do consider subbing. I'm really grateful to everybody who supported the channel. I had lots of positive feedback. We're past the 500 subscriber mark now, which is absolutely fantastic, so thank you very much. Next stop, 1,000. So I know there's still a lot of people who watch my videos who aren't yet subscribed, so if you haven't, then please consider. I really appreciate it. Until the next one, I'll see you soon.